Hey guys, welcome back. Today I wanted to go over one of my recent games, and as you can see in the title, this game is a pretty good example of how important endgames can be, especially when the games are close with your opponent, or even if you're down in the game. I had a really good early beginning of this game. I had a pretty messy middle of the game, but I was able to kind of capitalize on the end game and secure the victory for myself. So I kind of wanted to showcase that for you guys today. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we begin, remember if you like the videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks. So I was playing with the white pieces here, and I'm playing against Cent 210. And I like to go with the Ruy Lopez opening, and that starts with e4. My opponent plays c6, and this is known as the Caro Kann opening. I'm not going to get too, much of the details of this, but what he's doing is preparing d5. And you can kind of think of this in a way similar to the Sicilian because what he's trying to do is trade one of his, basically my center pawns for one of his wing pawns. So if he plays here and I capture and he captures, um, then he's basically possibly has a slight advantage in the game. But okay, I just continued with my development, so I played knight to f3, and he went ahead and played d5, which is the Caro Kann. And I kind of wanted to keep this game simple, so I just captured here, allowing him to recapture, and I played d4. This is known as the exchange variation of the Caro Kann because we exchanged our pawns on these two squares. So we keep going, and he plays bishop to f5. And I actually threw in a little check here. I noticed he already moved his bishop, so what I'm basically doing is these are the first three moves of the Ruy Lopez. And what I'm basically doing is forcing him to actually pin his own knight here. Since he already moved the bishop, I figure he wouldn't want to move back. He has nowhere else to go with his king. He's obviously not going to block with the queen, so I'm basically setting up this knight pin. So he just plays knight c6 here, protecting his king for now. And I played bishop to f4. So my thought process here was, yeah, I'm developing another piece. That's always good. But I also noticed he hasn't developed any of his kingside pieces yet, or basically these two here, the knight and the bishop. So it looks like he's trying to prepare to castle on this side of the board, and while I'm developing this piece, I'm also preventing him from castling for the time being. This is kind of a little added bonus there. And he throws in a queen check. Now it kind of looks like this bishop's undefended, but all I have to do here is block that with my knight. My knight's now guarding the bishop here, and we're all good. And notice how, I guess, what is this, 7 moves into the game? I have all 4 of my minor pieces activated right now. And he has only 2 of them. And he can't castle as of right now. And his queen is kind of out in the corner here. So far, pretty decent start to the game for white. And he plays e6. He's opening up his bishop here. And I go ahead and castle kingside. So before I start any attacks or anything like that, I definitely want to castle bring my king to safety, and I wanted to get rid of this pin that my knight was under by my opponent's queen, so I castle. And he plays bishop to e7. But I play knight to e5, and what I'm trying to do here is his king is still x-rayed by my bishop, so this knight's still pinned. And one thing that's good in chess, or a good rule of thumb, I guess, is if your opponent has a pinned piece, sometimes you can kind of pile up pressure on that pinned piece. So I'm attacking this piece a second time now, and right now he's only defending that piece once, and he obviously cannot move this piece. So that's my thought process there. And of course, he needs to defend a second time because I have 2 attackers, these two. So he's got to figure out a way to defend this piece a second time, and he can't really do that too easily. So he's going to actually retreat his queen to b6, also defending the knight here. And I took a little bit of time to figure out the next move that I wanted to do here, but I found one that I thought that is pretty good move, which is a4. So I'm basically threatening pushing this pawn one more square up, attacking this queen. Obviously, this pawn is protected by this rook on the a file. So what black really needs to play here is probably a5, not allowing me to take up this square with my pawn or move up another square. But my opponent is very focused on castling here, which, is a good thing. He probably should be, but he's pretty hyper focused on it. So he's just going to go and play knight f6. Since he doesn't really want to castle this side of the board anymore, I've already kind of screwed up his pawn structure here, and so he's trying to castle kingside and moving his knight out of the way to do that. And I push my pawn at a5. So now he's got quite a little conundrum here because yes, he can bring his queen back to c7 and continue defending this knight, but I really like the fact that my bishop is eyeing down this diagonal. So if there ever comes a time where I can move my knight out of the way and possibly pick up this queen or pick up other pieces, it's a pretty good discovered attack that I have going there. So it's not a great position to put your queen along this diagonal here that my bishop is eyeing. So he actually moves his queen all the way back to d8. And, the whole point of me pushing this pawn was to remove the defender of this knight, the second defender. So I went ahead and did a combination. I'm going to capture the knight here with my knight. But I analyzed this game afterwards. Turns out there's a much better move here for white. And I wanted to give you guys a few seconds and maybe pause the video, see if you can find a better move than what I was thinking, which is basically attacking this piece now. So give it a little thought, and I'll let you guys know in a second. Okay, so the best move here actually is pushing this pawn one more time to a6. So the point is you push to a6, and now you're attacking the defender of this knight. So let's say black takes my pawn here. Then now I just take this knight with check, and I'm attacking the rook here. So, that's very good for white. And not only that, but let's say he moves his king out of the way, or blocks. I take, he takes. I also get this pawn at the end of this, so now I'm up basically like a whole rook at the end of that exchange. Another really good move, even if he takes, you can even just take with the knight here. So now you've taken with the knight, you're attacking the bishop here, you're attacking this pawn as well, and as soon as I move this knight out of the way, say he plays a random move, so say I play here, I'm discovering checks on the king. So even if I play here, discover check. So there's a lot of combinations and like tactics and stuff you can work with when you have discover checks like that. So just a6 is a really good move. If he pushes the pawn forward instead of taking, you kind of do the same thing here. You just capture the knight with your bishop or your knight, and you have the same position that you had before that I just went over. The best move after I push a6 for black is actually castling, but it's a super tricky position for black even if he does this, because let's say here I capture the pawn with my pawn, right? Black plays a pretty natural move, defending the pawn promotion here and defending or protecting his rook from being captured. If he plays b8, well, now I capture this knight with my knight and I'm forking these two pieces. So just a6 is a really good move, really solid move here. But yeah, I did not see that. So instead, I capture with the knight here. And the combination still works out pretty well for me. So I capture the knight, he recaptures, and I capture his pawn with check. So I'm forking the king and the rook here. So he plays a good move, blocking the check with his knight. You don't really want to move the king because then he can't castle anymore. So he blocks the check, and I take the rook on a8, and he recaptures. So now, when all this dust settles, I am basically up a pawn, and I've traded my bishop for a rook, which is very good for me. It's very good for white. It's a good opening game, and we're winning. But as you'll see in a little bit, this game is far from over, and we have a lot of game left to be played here. So I play my queen to e2. Now, the reason for this also, why I did this, is another tactic that I spotted, which never came to fruition, but I knew he was going to probably castle here. And I noticed that if he castles, this bishop is not defended by any pieces anymore. So the rook will be on this square, and there'll be nobody protecting this poor bishop. So I was looking for some tactics that would involve maybe, let's say I capture this pawn with my knight. If I force this pawn out of the way of the e-file, now I'm attacking this bishop here. So that's kind of what I was looking at. But he castles, and I activate my rook. I move him off the f-file towards the center of the board, double these pieces on the e-file, and he plays queen to b7. So, let's see. So this queen move is attacking my pawn here, which I need to defend, and pretty simple move, playing b3, not allowing him to capture this. It seems logical, but he takes advantage of this move. I made plenty more mistakes here after this, but this is probably a mistake here. So he plays bishop to b4, and you'll notice when I make this pawn move here, I'm no longer defending this knight. So this knight's kind of vulnerable here. And I play a6 here. I'm kind of trying to push his queen away. So obviously if he takes here, I take the queen, so he has to react to my pawn move first. And he's just going to push the queen up one more square. Now I feel like, okay, I really need to defend this piece. I don't want to lose my knight, obviously. Not only that, but after he takes the knight, he's going to be forking my two rooks. So got to do something about that. And I play queen to d2. And this is just a mistake move. The reason this move doesn't really work, I guess, number one, you don't really want to tie your most important piece defending a knight, let's say. Obviously, your queen is your strongest piece. You want her to be free to move around the board, and you don't want her pinned here. So that's one thing. The other thing is, like I just said, I'm actually pinning my queen, so I'm basically never able to move this knight as long as this bishop is here. So it's like an accidental pin that I'm putting on myself here in the process of defending this knight. It probably would have been better if I brought my bishop back defending that way. Or even, let's say, I move my knight here. Yeah, he's attacking the square, but this rook, but I'm attacking the queen. So again, it's about can I up the ante of the attack here? Let me do something really quick. Sorry, little technical difficulties, and we're going to get back to this position I was in. Okay, so here we are, defending my knight with the queen. So he brings another attacker over, activating the rook, and this is a great move for black. So now you'll see he has two attackers of my knight, and I only have one defender. So I'm scrambling to try to find another defender here, right? So I play rook to e3. Notice how I'm totally locking in my bishop here. Bishop has kind of nowhere to go except forward or back to the square. So now I've got two defenders, but I feel a little bit of pressure here. And he plays knight to f6, and I noticed the intention of this move as soon as he made it. I'm very worried that he's going to play his knight here, which is a great square for his knight. My poor knight will be attacked a third time, and he'll also be attacking my queen. So this is just pretty scary for me. And even if he goes, say he goes here instead, well, now he's attacking my rook. So just something I'm pretty scared of, and something I thought I needed to address right away. So I go ahead and play f3. So now I'm blocking up these two squares for his knight. I don't want his knight to come here. So that's what I did, but it turns out my opponent has an easier way of adding a third attacker. He just moves his queen over to the c-file, and now he has 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking my poor knight. And if you take a look at this position, you'll notice there's actually no way here for me to defend this knight any further. This bishop can never get over to defend this knight. There's no way. So now I'm kind of in panic mode. I played g4. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe if I play g4, he'll go ahead with this combination that he's planning, that he's been building up, and at the end of it, maybe I'll just be able to collect his bishop, if I'm lucky. Just trying to put pressure on him and kind of divert his attention away and create some confusion in his mind with this move. And I wasn't expecting this, but he just went and captured my pawn. So I just took it right back. So that was a good trade for me, but we have this looming problem here on the c3 square. But it was right here after I made this move that I noticed the prize that would be awaiting me at the end of this series of moves that we're about to see. So after that, my opponent starts this combination. So you typically want to start the capture, the combination with the least valuable piece here. You don't really want to capture with the queen, because if you do that, let's say you do that, and I recapture, well, I'm up material now, and I can kind of ignore this at this point. I can run away or something, or divert attention even further away from that. You want to capture typically with your least important piece. And I did this stupid thing again, and so I need to restart this. Give me 1 second. Okay, we're gonna get right back. Here he starts it with the bishop, okay? And I don't really have a choice here. I kind of have to continue with this plan. There's really not much else for me to do. So I recapture with my rook. He captures with the queen. I capture with my queen. And of course, he finishes this whole thing off with his rook. So you'll notice this is what happens if the attacker has more pieces attacking than the defender has defending. He ends up winning this exchange. He has the last piece standing here. But this is where I played the move that started off my endgame. I played bishop b8. So I saw that once he would remove his rook from the square, he's no longer defending this file. Now, I pushed this pawn earlier in the game, and he's kind of been sitting here on a6, but he's pretty far up the board. And his only impediment to his movement here is his rival pawn here on a7. So once I get rid of this pawn, I have pretty unimpeded access to promote this pawn, and he becomes kind of unstoppable. So I'm essentially creating a passed pawn here. And there's no way for him to defend this square in one turn. So if he goes back, here, I could just capture with my bishop. So he takes my hanging pawn here with his knight. I'm not sure if he understands the problem here yet, but either way, I guess there's not much he can do at this point, at this time. So I just capture that pawn on a7. And now I want to get out of the way and let my pawn do his thing here on the a file. So at this point, he kind of realizes, I think, what's going on, and he places his rook all the way back. But now, I'm going to retreat my bishop, and when he moves over, I'm pushing my pawn up to a7. And now, what we have is my bishop defending this pawn, and he has his rook defending this pawn. His rook is now forced to stay on this square basically for eternity, defending this pawn, protecting me from promoting. And this is basically the textbook definition of a passive rook, a rook that isn't really contributing much, and securing a victory for black here. And the other thing that's important to notice is that my bishop's defending this guy, and he is the one who's defending his side. My bishop is worth less than his rook. So now, since my minor piece is doing this, I'm freeing up my own rook to do whatever I want him to do all along the board. So that's very important in the endgame as well. So he pushes his pawn here. So now what I'm trying to do, not only is this a passed pawn, but it's technically a connected passed pawn, because my opponent has no pawns on this file either. If I can get this pawn up to b7, if I can get these two pawns here, the game is just over. He basically he's going to lose his rook at a minimum if that occurs. So my goal now is to push this pawn. So I'm going to go and start doing that, and he's trying to move his knight into position to possibly stop that from happening. So he moves here, he's attacking this piece. I don't want to lose the pawn, so I move my rook up. But I continue with my plan. And here, after he plays this move, I think it would be better to play a4. So you'll notice here, if I play a4, his knight actually has nowhere to go without being captured unless he goes backwards. But instead, I'm willing to trade my pawn for his knight. So I go ahead and do that. He has to capture the pawn at this point. If he lets me push this pawn one more square up, the game is just over. So he sacrifices his knight to accomplish that. And now we have this position where, again, his rook is trapped there, and I'm activating my rook, and I'm starting to cause havoc on this side of the board. So he's trying to push all his pawns here. You can also see that I only have one pawn on the king side. He has a whole chain of pawns here, but my rook is pretty good. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to check his king. And now I activate my king. And that's one of the important parts in endgames is activating your king. Your king at the end of the game is actually more valuable than the bishops and knights. It's more valuable than a minor piece. Kings are super uh, powerful in endgames, and you want to activate your kings, get them into the action. And my goal here, if I can, is to bring this king all the way to b7. At that point, his rook will have nothing else, nowhere else to go. I can just basically capture that rook. Of course, my opponent might try to bring his king around, so around maybe this way, and lock out my own king. So we'll see how this goes. He starts moving his king. I'm moving my king. And I get to this square here. So this is a crucial juncture in the endgame. If he plays his king to e7, he's locking my king out of the d6 square because kings cannot get that close to each other. But if he does that, he's also giving up defense of this pawn. So I'm kind of putting him at a little crossroads here, but it's kind of like a pick your poison in a way. If he stays where he is, then I'm going to march my king across the board. And once I get here to this square or this square, his king cannot get to this area. I'm locking him out. So he goes ahead and plays e7. And now once that happens, I capture the pawn. He moves his king even closer, and now I capture the e6 pawn with my rook. And this is a nice little setup I have here because my rook's defended by the king. My rook is defending the bishop. My bishop's defending the pawn. So there's not really, there's not a weakness in this position for me right now, really. But he pushes his king further to c8. He can't go here. He can't go along this file. He can't go back here. So he pushes his king here, but now there's a nice little tactic for me to not win the rook, but simplify this position even further for me. So the move is rook to e8 check. So I'm basically skewering his rook. So I know once he moves his king out of the way, I capture, and yes, the king captures, but now his king is replacing his rook as the defender of this a8 square. So now his king is banished to the corner where he may never leave, while my king basically has total freedom to have a party and just eat up all of his pawns on my side of the board. So I start doing that. I just start eating all these pawns. And you might say, well, Dan, this bishop's not defended anymore. Isn't that a problem? Well, not really. So we'll see what happens. I take this pawn, and he takes the bishop. But now, unfortunately for him, by taking that bishop, he's no longer guarding the promotion square. So I promote to a queen, and I'm not going to lie, the rest of this game was probably kind of messy from a checkmating standpoint, but it's okay. We're just going to pretend like I did everything perfectly here. We keep going, and I'm checking, I'm giving a bunch of checks. He's kind of pushing himself into the corner here, which isn't ideal, but, this game is probably over at this point. So we keep going. And you'll notice here, interesting position. If you watched my last video, we talked about stalemates. This king has nowhere to go, but he's not in check, right? Can't go here. My queen's guarding all these squares, but he's not in check. He pushes his pawn to d3. If I take this pawn, this game ends in a draw. So you always got to be on your toes when it comes to this stuff. The last, 20 moves of this game, I had about a minute left on my clock, so I was moving very quickly, but you always have to make time to understand that and make sure you don't blunder here towards the end of the game. So instead of capturing this pawn, I just go ahead and checkmate him. I play queen h2 checkmate, and that is the end of the game. So I thought this was a really good example of endgames in general and how you play endgames. Obviously, I'm not a master endgame player, but my pieces were better positioned to basically close out this game for me. And a lot of it comes down to this passive rook in the corner for him. I was able to do what I wanted with my rook, and because I had this passed pawn so far up the board, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to waste his most powerful piece in the game, making sure that I could not promote this pawn. So the other thing I think that's important is You know, endgames have principles like creating pass pawns is always important. Putting your rook behind that pass pawn is typically a good strategy in endgames. Um, but another important thing about endgames is like every time your opponent makes a move anywhere in the game, but especially in the endgame, he makes a move, he's creating a weakness. And um, you'll notice how quickly you just shift attention over to this totally other side of the board um, whenever you sense a weakness in your opponent's move or your opponent's strategy. So, yeah, good stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this. And I will see you next time. All right.